The sensory systems of the body are the first to detect an external stimulus and send that information to the nervous system. They are composed of these specialized cells called sensory receptor cells. And those cells all synapse with sensory neuron axons to detect and transfer a stimulus to the nervous system. So for instance, this certain kind of sensory receptor cell here could be a chemoreceptor, which would attract or which would detect chemicals that bind to it and trigger an action potential that then crosses the synapse into the sensory neuron. Sensory receptor cells are contained within the major sense organs of our body, such as our nose, our eyes, our ear, etc. Sensory receptor cells are grouped by the type of stimulus that excites them. So for instance, those chemoreceptors respond to chemical stimuli. And we can see a specific example of chemoreceptors, the olfactory receptors in our nasal cavity, which again will bind inhaled chemicals, triggering an action potential that gets sent directly to the central nervous system. Taste buds on the tongue are another example of chemoreceptors, and you can see how they have structural adaptations designed to be able to catch these chemicals. The human eye is an example of a sense organ that uses photoreceptors, or sensory receptors that respond to light. Those photoreceptors are the rod and cone cells that are found in a layer of tissue called the retina of the human eye. We'll get to the retina in a moment, but first let's take a look at the anatomy of the human eye. So we want to be able to follow the path of light through the structures in the eye until it gets turned into an action potential. Light first is bent through a structure known as the cornea. So this refraction of light occurs when light strikes the rounded portion of the cornea and it bends the light inward. Now the cornea is just a transparent portion of a thicker outer layer known as the sclera, to which muscles are attached that move the eyeball. So the cornea is just a transparent portion of this where light is allowed to enter. That light is then going to pass through the pupil, just a small opening in the eye that is controlled by the surrounding tissue known as the iris. The iris opens and closes like the aperture of a camera to control the amount of light that comes in and out. And this is all smooth muscle, involuntary contractions. The iris is responsible for the color of your eye. So in the picture you can see here that colored portion of the eye surrounding the dark pupil. After passing through the pupil, light will then enter the lens and pass through it, and along the way be focused onto the layer of tissue with the photoreceptors, the retina in the back. Now the lens has to stretch in order to focus this image depending on its distance away from the eyeball. And we call that process of stretching to bring that image into focus accommodation, accommodating for the distance away that an object is. Okay, the retina is the layer of tissue that contains the photoreceptors. As you can see in this slide of the cell layers of the retina, you see a number of cell layers here before we get down to the band that contains the photoreceptors. So the retina contains those photoreceptors, the rod and the cone cells. However, you can see all of these many tissue layers also in the diagram here. So the rod and the cone cells are specially designed for certain purposes. The rods are spread throughout the retina, but only good for black and white images and night vision. No color or detail, that which is provided by the cones. Now, the cones aren't spread through the retina. They're in a small place called the fovea that you'll see in the next picture of the eye. And the cones are responsible for color and fine detail, sharper image. And we can see the rods and the cones down here. Here's some rods and there are the cones. And again, but these photoreceptors are buried in this layer, so we have a bit of an imperfect structure here where the light has to go through many tissue layers before striking the photoreceptors that then generate the action potential that then goes back through these cell layers until hitting a web of nerves and running down to where the optic nerve will be held. So the cells of the retina all synapse with nerve fibers that combine in the back of the eyeball as the optic nerve and carry those messages to the central nervous system. Where the optic nerve leaves in the back of the eyeball, because that's a big mass of optic nerve tissue combining there from all over the retina, there are no photoreceptors in that one certain place. And this leads to a blind spot in our vision because of the lack of photoreceptors.